Okay, and now we're going to finish up chapter 4 of Theodor Hitler's Revolution. I had to take a little break. I was losing my voice. So we're continuing on here. Let's see. As Congress eased restrictions on selling weapons to belligerents, America provided logistical support for England to continue the war. Under Washington's leadership, the Western Hemisphere countries proclaimed a nautical security zone southward from Canada. This zone, 300 to 1,000 miles wide in places, was off limits to combat operations of warring powers. Hitler ordered his navy to refrain from attacking British merchant vessels inside this belt. It substantially reduced the sea lanes the English Royal Navy had to patrol to guard cargo ships en route to Britain. The U.S. warships eventually assisted in protecting convoys, monitoring the movement of German U-boats, and reporting their findings to the Royal Navy. During September 1941, Roosevelt decided to become, quote, more provocative, end quote, adding that if the Germans, quote, did not like it, they could attack American forces, end quote. He ordered U.S. warships, quote, to attack any U-boat which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy, end quote. In 3 separate incidences in September and October, U.S. destroyers on anti-submarine patrols crossed lances with German U-boats. In one occurrence, the USS Greer assisted a British bomber in a depth charge attack against U-652. Bombarded for 4 hours, the U-boat finally... And there's a error in the PDF here. It skips a little bit. And then it says, European war seriously curtailed her commerce. As a result, the Japanese depended on increased trade with the United States. Supporting China in her war against Japan, Roosevelt imposed various embargoes on the island empire. On October 10, 1940, the Secretary of the Navy told Admiral James Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the Fleet, that the President wants U.S. warships deployed, quote, across the Western Pacific in such a way as to make it impossible for Japan to reach any of her sources of supply, end quote. Richardson objected that distributing our Navy in such a vulnerable manner against a formidable maritime adversary, and in so doing provoking it to belligerency, would be militarily senseless. Roosevelt dropped the idea. So here you can see Roosevelt's also trying to make war on Japan when 90% of America didn't want to enter into the war. What concern was it to the common American if the Jew bankers were losing out on their ability to skim off from international trade and enslave peoples with debt slavery? Moving on. Considering the USSR the greatest menace, Tokyo sought an understanding with the United States. In November 1940, Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuko asked Bishop James Walsh and Pater Drott of the Catholic Missionary School of Mary Knoll, New York, to deliver his peace proposal to Washington. Meeting with the President and Secretary of State on January 23, 1941, the emissaries relayed Japan's willingness to negotiate canceling her pact with Germany, evacuating her army from China, and respecting Chinese sovereignty. At the close of the 2-hour meeting, Roosevelt and Hull agreed to consider the proposals. Walsh and Drott heard nothing further from the White House. In February, Tokyo appointed Admiral Kishaburo Nomura, again acquainted with Roosevelt from World War I, ambassador to the United States. Meeting with the President on the 14th, and in over 40 sessions with Hull during the next several months, Nomura was unable to reach a compromise with the administration. Washington was in fact more interested in the action proposal submitted on October 7, 1940 by Naval Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCullum. The memorandum stated, quote, prompt aggressive naval action against Japan by the United States would render Japan incapable of affording any help to Germany and Italy in their attack on England. It is in the interest of the United States to eliminate Japan's threat in the Pacific at the earliest opportunity, end quote. So you also have to remember, so Japan was embroiled in Manchuria and China in a war, and the Roosevelts later supported, and Eleanor Roosevelt came out and supported Mao. They supported the communists against the nationalists, saying that Mao was an agrarian reformer. So you're going to see here that the Roosevelts, after FDR finally croaked in 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt kept on propping up communism in China. So this is important to remember for later, but we're going back to here the Pacific, what became the Pacific conflict with the Japanese. and how internationalists, so to say, got us involved against the will of the American people. Let me make sure I've got my offline recording going. Okay. McCollum suggested, among other things, that America, quote, completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire, end quote, and pressure the Dutch to, quote, refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil, end quote. McCollum cautioned, quote, it is not believed that in the present state of political opinion the United States government is capable of declaring against Japan without more ado. So here we see, the deep state of America, the Jewish central banking deep state, the Jewish media deep state, trying to get America into a war with Japan and Germany, but saying, oh no, 90% of Americans are against this war. How do we get them into it anyway? And you're going to see exactly how this is done very soon. The author introduced an 8-point program to provoke the Japanese. Jesus Christ. Quote, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war, end quote. In November 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson speculated in his diary on how to maneuver Japan into, quote, firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves, end quote. And here's a picture of what looks like a battleship with a bunch of seamen on it. And it said, Germany's nemesis in the Atlantic, the United States Navy. The picture of a ceremony aboard a U.S. battleship appeared in German publication describing America's armed forces as, quote, Roosevelt's trump card, end quote. Without Congress's knowledge, Hull delivered an antagonistic ultimatum to Japanese negotiators on November 26. So the Congress was trying to represent the 90% of Americans that didn't want a war. This is just like before the Iraq War. And, they're delivering ultimatums without the authorization of the Congress. This is incredible. The terms, had Tokyo agreed to them, would have substantially weakened Japan's position in the Far East, especially with respect to China and Russia, that they were unacceptable. The Japanese responded by opening hostilities against the U.S. and British bases in the Pacific. The infamous air raid on the U.S. naval base at Hawaii, conducted by 350 carrier-based Japanese bombers and fighters, galvanized American public opinion in Congress to enter the war. So, just as Poland and telling Poland to start a war and trying to maneuver Germany into firing the first shot in Poland was used to get Britain and France into the war in Europe, here we have the maneuvering, the strangling of Japan, and then the forcing of them through oil embargoes to get them to fire the first shot. And that's how they got public opinion for the war in Europe, which was the primary goal, not just war with Japan. Japan had just been wanting to curtail the Soviet Union that was about to come down through China later, and they eventually helped sponsor the Chinese communists, as did Eleanor Roosevelt, and you're going to see that later. Got it. And all of the Jewish-controlled press in the United States and Eleanor Roosevelt in the late 40s were saying, oh yeah, Mao's great, he's an agrarian reformer. That's what they always call these. They called Castro that too. Okay, the three-power pact that Germany had concluded with Italy and Japan in September 1940 was a defensive alliance. It did not obligate the Reich to declare war on the United States since Japan had struck the first blow. The Japanese, for example, had done nothing to assist the Germans in their war against the Soviet Union, which had been raging for 6 months, but U.S. warships were taking part in the Battle of the Atlantic. Federal attorneys, in fact, had determined that Roosevelt's swap in September 1940 of 50 destroyers in exchange for British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland did not only violated America's laws, but by international law put the USA in a technical state of war with Germany. So even before Pearl Harbor, the Jew-controlled deep state was already at war with Germany, giving weapons and stuff to the opposing side, to the Rothschild forces. Anyhow, the primary influence in Hitler's deliberations was the situation in the East. During the summer of 1941, the German armed forces had advanced far into Russia, winning impressive victories over the Red Army. Dogged Soviet resistance, overextended German supply lines, and a severe winter then forced the invaders onto the defensive. Another factor contributed to the shift of the initiative to the Russians: logistical support from the United States. Less than 5 weeks after Germany had invaded the USSR, Roosevelt's emissary, Harry Hopkins, was in Moscow offering aid to Stalin. God, the Soviet Union that had just killed like 30 to 50 million people prior to World War II And we're giving them aid? Why? And the answer is because the economic miracle in Germany had to be crushed. Without demanding any payment whatsoever, and despite protests from the U.S. Army, Roosevelt prioritized supplying the Russians with immense quantities of war material by sea. Stalin confessed in 1943 that without American aid, quote, we would lose the war, end quote. So this is where you see Jew communism and Jew capitalism working hand in hand. America was just as controlled by Jewish forces as the Soviet Union had been. And both hands came together to try and strangle the free peoples of Europe that had declared independence from the Jewish central banks. Moving on. Hitler believed that it would only be possible to regain the initiative against this military behemoth were the flow of supplies from the United States curtailed. Unrestricted submarine warfare could sever the nautical lifelines keeping the Soviet fighting forces combat effective. His U-boat commanders were still under orders not to torpedo American ships and to avoid the expansive security zone of the Western Atlantic. These orders not only prevented the German Navy from disrupting the delivery of ordnance to England and Russia, but were demoralizing the U-boat crews. Declaring war on the USA would free the German Navy to fight the Battle of the Atlantic with the gloves off and buy the Army time for another major thrust against Russia during the 1942 campaign season. Against the advice of Ribbentrop, Hitler declared war on December 11, 1941. This gained Germany a temporary tactical advantage. Hold on, where's the part? We're going to come back to this. Somewhere in this book is the part where it talks about how we knew that the Pearl Harbor thing was coming, and we ordered all the carriers to steam out so that only token ships could be sunk to, as a publicity stunt to get America into the war. I'll find it. If I can't find it in this version of the PDF, I'll find it. I own the book too, physically. The Reichstag convened on the 11th to hear the Führer's announcement. He recapped the history of his country's poor relations with Washington, beginning with Roosevelt's 1937 quarantine speech. Through the president's promises to Poland in 1939, and finally the U.S. Navy's operations on behalf of Britain. Hitler also offered a personal comparison of his own as a combat soldier during World War I with that of FDR, who had been the Undersecretary of the Navy. Quote, Roosevelt comes from a super-rich family belonging from the start to the class of people whose birth and background paved the way to advancement in a democracy. I myself was just the child of a small and poor family and had to struggle through life through toilsome work and by personal industry. When the war came, Roosevelt found a spot in the shade under Wilson and experienced the war from the sphere of those who reaped dividends from it. He therefore knew only the pleasant consequences of the clash of nations and states, those that provide opportunity for one to do business while another bleeds. As an ordinary soldier, I tried to do my duty in the face of the enemy during these 4 years and naturally returned home from the war as impoverished as I had entered it in the fall of 1914. I shared the fate of millions. Mr. Franklin Roosevelt shared his with the so-called upper 10,000. While Mr. Roosevelt, after the war, was already trying his hand at financial speculation, I was still lying in a hospital. End quote from Hitler. The German U-boat fleet launched its first coordinated operation, Paukenschlag, called English word for that is pounding, against American shipping on January 13, 1942. During the balance of that month, the Germans sank 49 merchant vessels in the Atlantic and in the North Sea. They tallied 84 steamers during a second nautical offensive in March. By the end of 1942, the U-boats had conducted 5 major operations, sinking 1,160 ships, totaling 6,266,215 tons. They targeted both convoys bound for English harbors and those delivering supplies to the Soviet port of Murmansk. This brought some relief to the German armies fighting in the east. In the long run, however, American wharves built more ships than the U-boats could torpedo. As the 1942 summer offensive against Russia lost its impetus, Germany gradually became snared in the east-west pincers as Hitler had feared. And there's a picture of German soldiers take instruction at the submarine warfare school. They would become the first of their countrymen to fight against U.S. military forces. And it looks like the part where Pearl Harbor had been planned is left out. Maybe it's in Chapter 5. I'm going to stop this recording and stop the stream and start another one, and we'll go on to Chapter 5. So I will see you again in a few minutes.